Right. Okay, so welcome to those who've all joined us now. My name's Andrew Lewis. I'm a Member of Parliament for Northampton South and former County Council leader myself, and I'm very pleased to be chairing the all-party parliamentary group for devolution. And I am joined by a number of my panel who are going to be asking our witnesses some questions today, further to our current inquiry, which is to talk about the role central government can have in furthering the cause of devolution and localism, given that the focus normally is the other way round. But I think we've sort of proved virtually to destruction that local government's interested in more devolution and interested in more work with government. It's really now important to turn that around and have a look at what the central government barriers, both in terms of structural barriers, but also possibly in terms of willingness as well, if we're able to be as blunt about that as we can be, to produce a report to see if we can further this agenda successfully. So the panel I've got Lord Kerslake, who's Vice Chairman of the APPG, well known to you all, very long history in this area as well as a lot of others actually. Got Baroness Eaton, former leader of Bradford City Council and former chairman of the Local Government Association as well.
That's what you need.
Yeah, it is. It's a division. Bob, could I ask you to take over for me while I go and vote? I'll be back.
Oh, yeah, thank you for that. Right, well, I think the plan here today, and thank you for joining us as witnesses, is to ask you a series of questions really around the whole agenda of devolution and Whitehall. And I think we're going to start off with Francesca. I don't. Oh, you didn't quite get through the introductions, but I might just ask colleagues to introduce themselves as well. Dorothy, do you want to say a few words? I need to unmute.
Colleague in the House of Lords, but my contribution to this, I hope, will that I was the directly elected Mayor of Watford for 16 years.
And then Morris, I think, as well.
Hello there. Hello, I'm leader of Hartsmith Borough Council, but I'm also a member of Hertfordshire County Council, and you all have heard recently, obviously, of considerations that were being given in Hertfordshire to more devolution and the reaction that had on a more local level among the districts and boroughs. So I'm delighted to be here to listen as well as to ask questions. Okay,
I think other colleagues may be joining us from the panel as we proceed. Should we kick off then, Francesca? Do you want to say a few quick words of introduction of yourself, and then we'll go into the questions?
Hello, and can you hear me all right?
Oh yes, thank you.
Thank you for inviting me. I am a Professor of Public Policy at the University of Manchester, and I'm the co-director of what's called Policy at Manchester, which is the university's Policy Engagement Institute. And I have research interests into governance reform and around devolution and equalities. And in fact, many years ago, in the 2000s, I was part of the team that evaluated new council constitutions, and I visited Baroness Eaton and Dorothy Thornhill in Watford and Bradford, respectively.
Oh, there we go. Thank you for that, Francesca. I'm going to go straight into questions, if that's okay. Yeah. And I think perhaps start with Baroness Eaton. No, you're on mute, Margaret.
Thank you. Can you hear me now? Good. Professor Gaines, in the course of your research, what have you found to be the main barriers within central government that limit the scope and the scale of devolution?
Well, I'm going to try and be brief because I know you want to hear from us all. So I'll be very brief. I think we've got constitutional, financial and organisational barriers, and they've played out over time in different time frames. So every academic you get in front of you will tell you we've got the most centralised system of local government relations, that local government lacks the ability to raise finance or utilise financial flexibilities, and are ring-fenced by allocations and social care, the social care problems. So there's a historic lack of trust or mechanisms to grant fiscal flexibilities through devolution. And I think in central government, despite the best efforts over many years, we still have a siloed system of central government. So that even when I think the baby steps of devolution deal making began, there wasn't really central coordination or drive from the centre of government or any constitutional settlement. And then, of course, devolution's taking place against austerity measures, which have caused cuts in central and local government, reductions in civil service numbers, and obviously things like Brexit and the pandemic are incredibly challenging and distracting. So in summary, that's what I'd say where we're at. With
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to move on to Baroness Thornhill. Dorothy, do you want to come in next? Again, unmute if you can.
Distracting, I agree, but in many ways I feel the current circumstance has thrown up the opportunities for devolution and showed us in a good light. I'm interested in what you see are the reforms. What reforms do you think within the Whitehall context which will enable increased scope and scale for devolution in England?
Well, again, I think that many commentators would say that the deals we have been negotiated piecemeal, without transparency, sometimes without public support, and don't really address these asymmetric power relations. And I would agree, it would be nice to start from a blank piece of paper and design Devo in a more coherent way, but politics isn't like that. That never happens. And I think what's informing my answer about what we can learn is what has been achieved, and I agree absolutely the necessity for further devolution to help with recovery. So I think there was a time to negotiate deals because it moved on the debate, it gave the experience and the exemplars of what could be achieved, and I think it provided an incentive for change where areas had to have difficult discussions about how to organise. The two things I would say from the Greater Manchester deals, which obviously I'm more aware of, is I think that linking the responsibilities of metro mayors and police and crime commissioners helps, because of joining up issues around crime reduction, safety, victim support, but also because it gives a administrative capacity at a time when there isn't a great deal of spare budgets to fund bureaucracy. And also linking health and social care, we were just beginning to see what could be achieved there, and actually tackling that going forward is so essential, and that would be something where there's capacity that would be important to learn from.
You want to come back for a follow-up, Dorothy, or perhaps we'll come back to supplementaries in a minute, and yeah. I'll take Councillor Bright Morris next in the questions.
Yeah, can I ask, following up from that, I think, Francesca, Professor, do you think one size fits all, or from your experience of what you've seen, lessons to be learned, etc., that there isn't a one size that fits all, and that there should be more scope for local deals working with the government to find a way that suits communities and across different parts of the country?
Yeah, I think this goes back to my the point that I made about it would be nice to design devolution, but we don't start from there. I would always like to see progress. I think there's a fatigue around small Devo deal-based mechanisms, but I do think that there are difficult conversations for people in different parts of the country, and there are different capabilities. You know, history and geography doesn't always lend itself as easily as it did in Greater Manchester. So what do? You've got a range of options, from not doing anything to saying we can't do anything unless we have a new constitutional settlement. And I suppose I would like to see something down the middle that progresses the devolution conversation. And that what's essential in that is a framework, whether that's through a white paper or some kind of mini inquiry, but something that sets out what can be achieved, what's on offer, what's required in terms of capacity, what fiscal flexibilities can be granted, and you know, to have that kind of concordat, if you like, I think is important and affects all areas. It would allow those areas who are grappling with local government reorganisation or lack of coterminous boundaries or just not enough capacity to deliver on some of these overarching agendas. I think it's important to have a route map so that people know what is possible. I hope that answers your question.
If I could just tease out a little more. So we know where we want to get to. You've mentioned that we're in an over-centralised situation, and therefore there will be people who will say, well, if you're in an over-centralised position, we don't want central government to be telling us what we have to do. We'd rather be sitting with them saying, this is how we think we can get to the end point. Mm-hmm. Are you happy for us to try that out? And I suppose it's whether or not you would support, we all getting to the same place, but how we get there.
I think I would support an honest conversation about what is possible, what's on offer, and what might be achieved.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I'd like to come back to that in a minute, but I'm going to welcome Clive to the meeting, Clive Betts. And Clive, you're keen to come in, just to say we've started the questions and talking to the witnesses in turn. So over to you, Clive.
Okay, Bob, I wasn't actually on from the beginning, so I did hear it all. So that's fine. Just let's push a bit hard on this. You know, the recent sort of rows over tiering and issues around COVID have highlighted the profile of mayors. But if we actually look at what's been given by central government, it is about given. There's been no powers to raise money, nothing at all in any of the deals that I can see. And in terms of actual giving powers from central government, BEIS, DWP, Department of Transport really haven't given anything at all, have they?
No, however, I wasn't arguing that they had.
No.
And you know, and I think I completely agree that further devolution is essential for recovery. But I think there are real difficulties, aren't there, ahead because of that lack of fiscal flexibility, and there isn't sight of what's going to happen with the Shared Prosperity Fund. We don't know when the white paper's coming out, so we can't even have a conversation about things that looked like they were online in March. Is that what you're getting at?
Well, I'm also getting that you know, any other country, Western democracy, local level, you'll actually be able to raise your own finance to a much greater degree. But then maybe you just like to reflect on the fact we've got the other problem, haven't we? That we've got such an unequal country that if you give more powers at local level to raise money, the ability to raise it will be very, very skewed in favour of the richer parts of the country. So how do you square that dilemma?
Well, I'm sorry, I don't wish to add to the issue, but I think the ways in which you could think about raising money are really problematic, aren't they? In a global pandemic, you know, a tourist tax is difficult, a business rate retention is difficult. So I think there are real problems going forwards in thinking how you can provide that fiscal flexibility. But better brains than me, who understand local government finance, do have ideas. So I think there are ways forwards, but it's a harder climate than even earlier this year, I think.
Can I just quickly follow up Clive's question? Recently I was on an event based around Yorkshire with my former boss, Eric Pickles, and he suggested the introduction of an online sales tax, which would then be effectively assigned to local government as an additional source of income. Around some of the weaknesses with the business rates model. I wonder what you thought about as an option.
Look, local government finance is a very specialised area, and I'm not going to pretend that you need Tony Travers here to really answer those questions. But it seems to me that this is the part of the I'm just going to wriggle out of that and say this is part of the conversation, the honest conversation that should happen, because there clearly is a need for some redistributive measures at central government level, given the unequal regional situation, which is going to be worse after the pandemic, given the limitations on what taxes you can raise locally, given the difficulty of, say, relying on business rate retention. So, but there must be some way of progressing to a single pot deal type of scenario that is moving the conversation forwards.
Okay, thank you for that. We could ask a lot more questions, but I think we should sort of resist the temptation and perhaps come back if there's time towards the end. So thank you very much for that. I think our next witness is Professor Colin Kopas, who is the Emeritus Professor of Local Politics at the Montford University. Colin, did you just want to introduce yourself, and then we'll go into questions again?
Yep, sure. As you say, I'm an Emeritus Professor of Local Politics from De Montford. I'm also a visiting Professor at Ghent University, although I'm not visiting very much at the moment, as you might imagine. And I've been spending, I have spent several more years, and I like to think, in and on around local government politics in one way or another.
Okay, thank you. So we'll then move to questions. And again, I'll look to my panel colleagues first, and I'll come in with a question myself, I think. Let's start with Dorothy next on this one, Baroness Thornhill.
Can I ask you to pick up from what Francesca said about the kind of what I would call political and cultural issues, because it seems to me we get talking about nitty-gritty, but the real elephant in the room, and it's perhaps an elephant that makes itself heard as well, are the kind of cultural and political issues. So in a way, it's what do you consider to be a successful story in the devolution in England? But in your view, what's the thing? How can we shift what is quite a historical and cultural barrier that has been there for some time? How would you suggest moving forward on this?
I think the secret really is it is a major cultural and constitutional change. I think there is a lot of fear at the centre, both within Westminster and Whitehall, about allowing local government to emphasise the government in its title, and we're nowhere near being able to break or change that culture. Different departments across Whitehall have different attitudes and different approaches to local government, but none of them seem to really fundamentally understand the idea that local government is a governing institution. So until we're able to break that centralist thinking that runs across the whole of Whitehall, then I think very little will change. The other problem I do want to just raise this issue, because it links into what's already been said, and that is that I think in England what we've seen is decentralisation rather than devolution. Now I'm not playing with semantics here.
Yeah, no, there is a difference.
Services, budgets, responsibilities and functions, passed down from the centre, not to local government, but to new combined authorities, new structural configurations. We haven't seen in England anything on a par with what has gone to Scotland and Wales. So whatever happens to English local government, England will still be shortchanged in the devolution agenda, because we haven't seen any fundamental shift. There's no protection for local government as an entity. And I think it leads me on, sorry, I've gone off your question a bit, but it does make sense.
No, I think that hits the question.
Ah, right. Okay. It also, there is absolutely no reason in either theory or practice why devolution must be linked to structural change in local government. We have already the biggest units of local government across Europe by a country mile. We have the fewest councillors by a country mile. We also sit at the lowest level of the league table of electoral turnout. And I don't think that it's a coincidence that those other two factors are in play that means we do sit at the bottom of the turnout league. We have an obsession with unitary authority. We have an obsession with creating bigger units of local government. We seem incapable of learning from the fact that many councils across Europe, which are far smaller than ours in terms of population, run services like water, sewage, other public utilities, hospitals, have far greater tax raising powers. Local authorities in Belgium actually have an unlimited ability to raise taxes on anything they want to. So if they want to tax dog ownership, they tax dog ownership. We are, and I would argue in this country, we are terrified of allowing local government that sort of freedom and that sort of power and responsibility. And picking up on the finance issue, I think Francesca is absolutely right. The time of a pandemic makes it extremely difficult to shift the agenda forward on finance. But one of the problems I often hear, and my favourite local tax is a tourist tax. Francesca happened to mention that. It's taxation without representation. You know, I go to wherever on holiday, I pay the municipal tax. I don't move there to vote the scoundrels out, you know, but it pays for all of those hidden costs. And of course, the argument is, well, what happens if you're in an area that doesn't have a big tourist industry? Well, if those areas that do are able to tax their tourists, then that frees up central government grant to go to those areas that don't. But we need to start trusting local government to make decisions about finance. We need to be thinking about what primary powers do we pass down to local government, and we need to focus not on structural change. We are in danger of losing sight of the word local in local government if we're not careful. And I'm very pleased to see that the government has started to row back slightly on linking structural change to devolution, because there is, as I said, no need to do that. I'm sorry, I've that's a long-winded answer to your question. I do apologise.
Thank you.
Pertinent.
Very pertinent. I think a lot of us felt that. Colin, can I quickly follow up on the culture point, because this is where I was going to ask a question. Some have argued that really we, in a sense, get this debate wrong by focusing on the mechanics of devolution and not actually starting with trying to achieve and get parity of esteem between central and local government. That at the core of the problem is a lack of understanding and valuing of a locally democratically elected leadership. And I just wondered what you thought of that. And I just illustrate it with a quick example of when I went to Spain and talked actually to the British ambassador in Spain. He said, if you come to Spain and ask who are the influences you ought to meet, I would tell you central government in Spain, but also the local government through the regional autonomous regions. If I came to if you tried to reflect that in the UK and somebody came from Spain and said, who should you talk to or the influences, it'd almost certainly be all Whitehall. So is the issue really here about basically trying to get a parity of esteem and recognition, but if you like, of importance?
Yes, I absolutely is, and I don't know why we've not been able to achieve that. And I think the metro mayors were a step in the right direction. But if you look at the configuration of the mayoral authorities that we have, what they've got is the bully pulpit. They haven't got the powers, responsibilities, and again, as Francesca said, the financial ability. So we've seen around some of the government's decisions about COVID, we've seen some of the mayors take up that challenge and use their office as a national platform to argue from, which mayors across the continent do every day. Yet as soon as that happens in this country, you know, the sort of reaction is, well, who do these people think they are? They're only mayors. And I think we really do need to again, learn that lesson of why we are so incapable of respecting local government as an institution that emphasises its title, local and government. And I think I can only, you know, look back throughout history to see that we've always struggled with this idea that, you know, we hear things like the sovereignty of Parliament, the supremacy of Parliament, and I think that makes it very difficult for other political institutions to really sort of be able to play on a level playing field with the centre. We have a centralist culture, not just amongst Whitehall, but also I think amongst the populace, who look to government to solve everything, as opposed to looking to their councils, because they know that those institutions lack the power to solve some of the problems they're dealing with. MPs' postbags are chock full of letters that really should be sent to councillors and mayors. And it's all to do with the fact that people almost leapfrog over the council. It's important when a service breaks down. It's important if the dustbin doesn't get empty. But in terms of dealing with some of the big political, cultural issues, we struggle with that concept of focusing on the government aspect of government. And I did some work, it was a long time ago, with what was then the Political and Constitutional Reform Committee, which produced a report in 2012, which looked at trying to codify the relationship between central and local government. But you always stumble or flounder on the rock of what the centre gives, the centre can take away. And at the moment, devolution is popular, but at some point it won't be anymore. And the danger is that all of that stuff that has been decentralised will simply be hoovered up. And unless we do something fundamental to prevent that from happening, then, as I say, the centre gives, the centre takes away.
Thank you. I'll ask Margaret to come next.
Yeah, do you think there's been anything that's been successful as far as devolution so far that you could sort of highlight? And what's perhaps been a great deal less successful in the devolution that's taken place?
I think I mean, I don't want to sort of run away with the idea that I think it's all been a disaster and that it's terrible and we haven't gone far enough. I do, but I don't want you to think that, because there have been a number of successes. And if you look at certainly the office of elected mayors within combined authorities, I think a lot of authorities struggle with the idea of an elected mayor, but that as an institution does start on the road to decentralising or to breaking the centralist culture. So the very fact that we've got as far as having elected mayors with the powers that they have got, with the responsibilities that they've got. And I also think another success in the process has been that devolution deals look slightly different. So what you've got is packages of deals that suit what is required in any one particular part of the country. And I think actually that's an unsung success. We haven't worked from the model of this is what you've got to have, apart from elected mayors, I say, but this is what you've got to have. If it doesn't suit, tough luck. We've been able to show some flexibility in those deals. So I think that as itself shows that we can open the door of Whitehall to be a little bit more flexible and a little bit more sophisticated. So whatever led to that process needs to be encouraged. I mean, there have been problems. You know, some devolution deals have collapsed because, and this has been local government's fault, I think, rather than the centres, because of the elected mayor. You know, councils have been sort of calling for things for decades, services, responsibilities, budgets. You get as far as the centre saying, yep, you can have all of that, but you've got to have an elected mayor, and they go, we won't have it then. So I think you have to see that there's been some failures at the local level, failures of imagination, failures of courage, if you like, and also failures at the centre for not guaranteeing that what has come down will always stay there, and also for making the deal process overly complex and overly centralised. My recent research among councils is showing that there is still a scepticism about this agenda. There's a frustration about it being top down and very much led by the centre. And I think that, you know, the lesson there is that we need something that's driven more by our existing councils. And I suppose the other, you know, I wouldn't say a failure, but the other negative aspect has been this focus on structure. It's been, let's create combined authorities, let's get LEPs lined up with those, let's worry ourselves about borders. Can one council be in more than one LEP or under more than one combined authority? My view is always let 1,000 flowers bloom, and if local authorities want to be more than members of more than one LEP or more than one combined authority, then let them do it.
Colin, can I jump in and ask a question? Is that all right? It's Scott Mann from North Cornwall. We are in a rather unique position in Cornwall, having a devolution deal with a mayor. And one of the questions that I get asked about quite regularly is around net inward investment. So where mayors are able to take delegations and try and drive investment from other parts of the country. And I think my point of view, one of the advantages that some of the areas that have got combined mayors is that they're able to be a kind of figurehead for some of that net inward investment. Have you got an assessment of what you think around that area specifically?
Yeah, no, absolutely. The ability of an elected mayor to negotiate, to work with all sorts of external organisations is often easier and greater than, let's say, a council leader. And I'm not ignoring the fact that many of our council leaders across the country do some absolutely phenomenal work in operating with businesses, with external organisations of all sorts. And in fact, most councillors now and council leaders are spending more time working with external bodies than they are working within their council themselves. So, but I just think that the office of mayor is, or an elected office, is understood more by the outside world, and certainly comes with a great weight of legitimacy. If you look like, if you've got an area with an elected mayor that's got a population of 300,000 people and a council of 60 members, that elected mayor has got to be elected by 50% plus one of the population, not by 32 councillors. Businesses, external organisations understand that that comes with a legitimacy. And I think that just opens doors slightly easier. And in terms of areas like Cornwall, I think there is a myth that goes around that elected mayors are an urban institution. They're only things that can suit an urban area. That's simply not the case. Where we look at where elected mayors exist across the globe, across Europe, we see mayors in rural areas, very rural areas, in fact, acting as that figurehead. It's not to say that no council leader cannot do that. They can do it. I think just for an elected mayor with the right sort of powers, it's easier. And I think that's the other argument around this whole issue of devolution. We've created these elected mayors, but we haven't really devolved the sorts of powers to them that are commonplace with local government across the globe.
Thanks for that. Just want to see if either Morris or Clive wanted to come in. And
if I can just have a quick question. I know we're running out of time. I think to a certain extent the questions have been answered in respect of has the government been able to create the right balance between bespoke deals and a standardised devolution baseline. You've said that you've noticed some rowing back in recent weeks and recent times in relation to the exact type of structures. And I wonder whether or not you think, A, that's a good thing, because as I said earlier to Francesca, do you believe that one size doesn't fit all? And do you believe taking into account growth deals, for example, local growth deals and growth boards can also be a suitable way forward for some areas?
No, absolutely. That anything that brings local government together in a cooperative set of working arrangements that doesn't require structural change has to be encouraged. There's always a big question about, well, where's the democratic element of this? Where's the accountability? And that's where scrutiny is the Cinderella of our structures. So wherever there are these joint arrangements of one sort or other, whether it's local resilience boards, growth boards, whatever it happens to be, scrutiny must be there front and centre as the way in which those institutions are given a line of accountability. And in terms of one size fits all, if it's devolution, then the answer is clearly no. One size doesn't fit all. What we need is a system that grows from the bottom up, that fits our localities, that encourages groups of councils to come together in a sort of organic fashion and look to those services and those functions and those responsibilities and those extra powers that suit their area. It's nice to have a framework, but the trouble with frameworks is they become the rule book. And I would always caution against there being a rule book for devolution.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's probably a good point to hand over to Johnathan, Carr-West. We're both on the Centre for Governance and I'll hand back to Andrew now as well as the chair, having returned from your vote, Andrew.
Thanks very much, Bob. Thanks for stepping in there. Really appreciate it. That obviously would be the exact moment the division bell would go. But yes, Johnathan, Chief Exec at the LGIU. Who from the panel would like to ask Johnathan the first question? Clive, you didn't quite get in with Colin, so do you want to be first?
Andrew, thank you very much indeed. Johnathan, we've had conversations about this on previous occasions at the Select Committee. I just want to come back to the point I raised before, that we often talk about devolving powers, but very little about devolving fiscal responsibility down. It's almost as though the Treasury's got a no-no to this. You can have a bit of money to spend that we give you, but you can't actually have the powers to raise it. Do you think this is a really big challenge for us in terms of where we take the devolution to now in this country?
Yes, I think it's a fundamental obstacle. In the end, real devolution has to involve fiscal devolution. And of course, that's, as Francesca was saying at the beginning, that's not a radical idea. If you look around the world, there's no other country in which only 2% of tax is decided by one man. There has always been a man in number 11 Downing Street. It's way out of kilter with everywhere else. So unless you see real ability for local authorities to raise money, and we talked about some of the ways in which they could do that already, and indeed to spend money. So we had experiments a decade ago around total place and community budgeting, baby steps towards just giving locations a pot of money to spend, but we've never really embedded that. So we still have money coming down through in sort of ring-fence silos from different Whitehall departments, and then we wonder why we can't sort of join it all up and achieve sort of magically sort of cooperative services on the ground level. It's the lack of fiscal devolution is a fundamental barrier.
Right. So can I come on and follow the same questions before then? Given we have such an equal country, you go to Sweden and you look at fiscal devolution, it's fine because there's not that much difference in income levels in different parts of Sweden. But in this country, there are massive differences in people's incomes and people's wealth in different parts of the country. So you hand down the powers to raise money to local level, and then you find that some areas are much more able to raise it than others. Actually, the areas with the greatest problems are the least able to raise the money. So how do we square that circle?
Sure, and look, and part of the challenge, I think, is that we consistently, over the last sort of 10 years, we've consistently fallen in between two stools. So on the one hand, we say, hey, we want local government to be entrepreneurial and risk-taking and raise its own money. Oh, but it mustn't fail. Well, which one is it? You know, you can make an argument for local government as sort of financially autonomous, or you can make an argument that it should be funded by central government, but we kind of fall in between the two consistently. There's lots of ways we could look at this. You know, we can tourist taxes won't work. I mean, I think the point is that nothing will work for everywhere. So you say, oh, we could have a tourist tax. Well, that will work for Bath or Oxford. It may not work for some other places, but you have a sort of toolkit of different measures. The Institute for Fiscal Studies has talked about a local share of income tax. That wouldn't be that would work equally across the country. We could look at different forms of environmental taxes. You could, we're very resistant to the idea of any sort of tax competition in this country, but that works in other places. We could look at online sales taxes. Those wouldn't quite iron out the inequalities you mentioned, but they would to some extent. And of course, on the spending side, you can have single place-based budgets that wouldn't discriminate against different parts of the country. And this is incredibly complex, but I think the point is that there are loads of good ideas out there.
Yeah.
And these are all things that work in other places, and not in strange places. They work in comparable economies like the USA and France and Germany, municipal bonds in Sweden, for example. And here, they're just not even on the table. So instead of having a sort of full consideration and a full review of these things, saying, okay, what are the different fiscal methods that might work for different parts of the country and how can we start to move towards them? We've spent, 5 years tying ourselves in knots around the retention of business rates, an increasingly defunct tax that's sort of becoming obsolete by the day. So I think, in a sense, your question is the right one, but it's a question that we're still, we're not even at the stage where we can answer that question yet, because we haven't done the preliminary thinking, the preliminary openness to even look at the options.
Okay, thanks, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Clive. Who else would like to ask a question of Johnathan, who's on the panel? Margaret, did you indicate?
Well, yes, please. I think I would be really interested in how the working relationship between local and central government can be improved so that government begins to trust local government more to deliver. What do you, because it's been a constant concern in all my local government time, which is a long time. What do you suggest we could do what would help that?
I mean, that's a very tough question, because I would, not to bring the group down too much, but I would hazard that it's getting worse. And I think in some ways I'd approach that by looking at the ways in which it's getting worse and trying to imagine how those might have been different. So, I think the pandemic has been really interesting in this regard. We've seen local government frankly sort of ignored, the cries of sort of public health directors to sort of get involved, overlooked in terms of test and trace until very late in the day. We've seen sort of, conflict between elected mayors and central government. I mean, coming back to the point about mayors and sort of devolution, is anyone in central government right now thinking, hey, I'm glad we've got a mayor of Manchester? We've moved backwards on all of these things. These relations are at an all-time low.
Yeah.
But I think we could try, just as a sort of thought experiment, to imagine how that might have looked differently. We could imagine a world in which local government and central government had worked together on test and trace, had worked together around putting, protecting communities. We can imagine a world in which there were tough but positive negotiations between local leaders and central government about how the pandemic response should look in their area, how economic support should look in their area, how restrictions should have been varied. So although we saw that, I think, all go wrong and take us in the wrong direction, and frankly to a place where local government in many ways has done a much better job than central government through the pandemic. But I fear that we will see vengefulness rather than gratitude on the part of central government as we emerge from this, with further restrictions on local government funding and powers. So this is not really an answer to your question, Margaret, but the best I can do is to say, well, let's look at what's happened and try and imagine what the reverse of that would have been, and how that could have taken us forward, through working together towards outcomes to a better place. Because I think in the end, relationships, you know, as we all know, they're founded on trust, and they're built through doing things together. And part of the challenge here, yeah, as Colin said earlier, is that we talk about all of this in very abstract ways, and we rush to structure, and so actually thinking about what could we do together and how could we work together.
I suppose politics enter that too, don't they?
Yeah,
party politics,
absolutely.
Unfortunately.
Party politics do enter it, and yes, rarely in ways that are helpful, I think.
Yeah, I agree.
Bob, you were going
Thank you. It's gone quiet.
Johnathan, to fill a pregnant pause, can I just briefly ask then? I think there are, by either default or hopefully by planning, more local government people who are now in Parliament, in both houses, including the chairman of this particular panel. Andrew, do you think that actually local government could have or should have a greater role within development on national policy? Do you think we could be listened to a bit more, because we bring experience to the table, which helps work in a more collegiate way, and then would bring more trust to the table also?
Well, I mean, again, if I was being slightly provocative, I'd say, you know, could you be listened to less currently? I think, you know, yes, you know, we've called in the past for what we called a sort of Senate of mayors, I mean, not just mayors, but you know, elected mayors, combined authority mayors, local leaders. You could have such a group. They could take, you know, they could help review legislation. They could take part in committees. You know, you absolutely could have formal structures that put local leaders in the heart of policy making. But it's, you know, we're a long way from that. And so I think in a sense, the influence of local leaders is, you know, someone used the phrase bully pulpit earlier. I'm not sure it's quite that, but but I think that soft power is gradually becoming more and more effective. And so I think it will sort of happen by default, but I think we could be much more structured and much more proactive and positive about it.
Okay, thank you.
Bob.
Sort of following on.
Oh, sorry. Can I just quickly ask a question, leading on from what Francesca said earlier, which is, do we think the kind of deal-based approach has been useful, but has essentially run its course? You know, is there more to get out of that way of thinking about devolution, or should we, as I think you said also, look more at a framework approach to devolution that allow different options and different menus for different places?
I think I would fall somewhere between those two options. I think the deal, you know, the deal approach has got us a certain way. And, you know, and look, we argued, you know, back in 2014, we argued for the deal-based approach, and you know, it was frankly one of those sort of be careful what you wish for situations. I don't think a deal-based approach was wrong in theory, but I think it was on both sides quite badly implemented in practice.
Dorothy.
Kind of following on from that, in a way, from your experience, what feedback did you get from councillors about the experience of working on the negotiations in the deals? In other words, what were the, you know, what did they say to you were the real sticking points? And are there any lessons we can learn from that?
Absolutely, there are. I mean, I think it was, to be uncharacteristically diplomatic, it was patchy, I think. I think the experience people had was that it was a bit, look, you know, there was this sense that you went into a negotiation where, well, for a start, it wasn't really a negotiation, was it? It was a sort of supplication in which you were sort of asking for, you know, going with the begging bowl to central government. But there was this, you know, hey, it's, you know, what should it look? Well, you tell us, you know, there's no template for this, except it turned out there was. You know, you can have anything you want as long as it's a combined authority with a mayor. So there was this sort of slightly disillusioning process of discovering that actually there was, you know, a template in Greg Clark's desk, and that's what you had to do. I think there was also a big problem, and I think it was Francesca who mentioned this earlier, that all of these things were done kind of secretively, one-on-one. So there was no opportunity for local government to, you know, to sort of pool resources, to learn from each other, which also, by the way, meant that loads of councils spent thousands and thousands of pounds on consultancies asking the same set of questions that they could have pulled together. But you know, there was no ability to form a kind of, you know, collective position, to see what other people were getting. I think it is also true that there were failures of imagination on local government side. So, you know, a lot of people saying we don't want a mayor. All right, what's your proposal for the governors? Well, just not a mayor. Well, you've got to do better than that. And the other element I would add is that this wasn't just about that we need to learn from, is this wasn't just about the negotiations between councils and central government. It was also about the ability or otherwise of councils to negotiate with their own members and with the public. So where a lot of these deals fell down in reality, particularly in two-tier areas, was when they, you know, having been negotiating like leaders in a metaphorically smoke-filled room with Greg Clark and George Osborne or their successors, when they then went back to their constituent councils, people voted against it because they hadn't been engaged in it. And that's before you even think about how far the community have or haven't been engaged with it. So there was negotiation up to central government was problematic, but negotiation sort of sideways to other bits of local government, I think, was also challenging. So on all of that, I think the lessons have to be about sort of transparency. They have to be about thinking about outcomes rather than just structure. I think that rush to structure was really damaging. I think, you know, they were all framed, so far Devo deals have all been framed around growth, which is important. But what we've seen in places like Greater Manchester and the West Midlands is that they then end up kind of retrofitting ideas around public service reform, ideas around local democracy are kind of sort of squeezed in as an afterwards. And you know, certainly the experience I think of people you know, that I hear from people in some of those areas are saying, we wish we had had more space to think about the local democracy elements of this, to think about the public service reform elements of this in the negotiation process, rather than signing up to what was essentially a sort of fairly transactional growth deal and then having to do all of that stuff later.
Yeah, thank you.
Any final questions for Johnathan from the panel? I mean, Maurice asked me, didn't really answer as chair, I suppose, but I'll say that whilst it's encouraging that there's a larger number of local government personalities in the House of Commons, I'm not perceiving that it's made that much difference as yet in terms of the overall impact. And, you know, I do think that, if I may put it this way, that of Westminster fetishism has sort of held the country back in terms of local government reform in a way that it hasn't done in some other countries that don't sort of overly fixate on their members of parliament to the exclusion and detriment of other people involved in the democratic structure of the country. And Clive and Scott and my and others inboxes saying, why haven't the bins been collected? I've got a pothole at the end of my street, etc. will testify to that. You know, we all did our time in local government to deal with those things. We're looking to move on to something else and let people locally get on with the things that they've got the knowledge and expertise and levers to deal with. I mean, hence this inquiry, but you know, I don't think it's going to be excessively gloom-a-don of me to say that we've got a long way to go.
A long way to go.
Has anybody got any final thoughts before we wrap up? We are slightly over time, but not by that much. Francesca.
I just wanted to say very briefly, because your session was about what can happen in central government, I think, to support devolution. So I just want to say, I had a kind of a wish list. Prime Minister backing. You know, let's have a moonshot plan for Devo, because I think it's only Devo that can deliver recovery, net zero, social care, public health. Cabinet Office championing is essential to bring together all the departments, disentangle devolution and local government reorganisation, and get some regional support, some civil service regional support to provide and help with capabilities. I didn't get a chance to say that earlier, so I thought I'd nip in.
Francesca, Colin, you wanted to chip in just briefly?
Just very quickly and uncharacteristically for me, I think the problem with the devolution agenda at the moment is predicated on an economic imperative. It's not a conversion at the centre to devolution as a good way of encouraging good governance at all levels. It's growth orientated and it's economically driven. we need a devolution, a set of arrangements that are focused on what is right to be decided and delivered at what levels within our system. And I think breaking that economic imperative, as important as it is vital. Otherwise we get devolution structured and packaged for one sole reason, and then when that changes, where are we? So I think we need a real conversion at the centre to devolution as being the right way of governing the country.
Very good. So we've got more of these sessions to come, more witnesses to hear from when this recording goes out, and encourage everyone else to put their submissions in, which we're open to until the 8th of January. I'm very grateful to everybody for their time, and I look forward to the next session. And let's carry on with our dialogue. Thank you all very much indeed, and I'll declare the meeting closed. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. That was really interesting. Thank you.